welcome to episode 2 of Chronicles of Salafism in the UK, an insider's perspective. In the previous episode, I discussed my conversion to Islam and the subsequent religious instruction I received throughout the course of that year. In this particular episode, I intend to cover events across 1991. That will be my religious instruction again, and the prevailing climate, not only societally, but globally. My last lesson in 1990 was on the 26th of December, and that was around learning 2 short chapters of the Quran again, the 110th and 111th chapter, alongside principles about congregational prayer. The next time I was to sit for further classes and religious instruction would be on the 13th of December 1991. And so there was a gap. The whole of January, no lessons took place. And one of the reasons for this was due to the global situation at the time. In 1990, we had seen the build-up of coalition forces preparing to go to war with Iraq after Saddam Hussein had entered Kuwait and occupied part of that country. So on January 17th, we saw Operation Desert Storm begin with a US-led coalition bombing Iraq. And I remember that particular occasion very well because I was in my bedroom with family members watching TV, and like millions of others across the world, witnessed the first and largest aerial bombardment of a country in history. So this particular event arguably shaped where we are now for a number of reasons. And I want to refer to the ones that I'm aware of as they impacted upon us, our community, and our development as Muslims. We immediately saw splits in the Muslim world and between scholars that we referred to. So, for example, the then Mufti of Saudi Arabia at the time, Sheikh Ibn Baz, and his colleague, Sheikh Uthaymin, they had issued edicts to allow American troops to enter Saudi Arabia. And this caused huge uproar and anger across parts of the Muslim and Arab world because of the sacredness of the land that housed the Haramain, the Makkah and Medina, 2 of Islam's holiest sites. And not only was this opposed by the general populace of Muslims to varying degrees, we saw scholars of similar repute, like Sheikh Al-Albani, opposing his peers, his contemporaries, on their decision to issue such a fatwa, such an edict. Now, it's important to highlight that these 3 scholars that I've just mentioned were the leading scholars of that era, Salafi scholars. And as we were growing and learning about our faith, we quickly established through continual reference to them that they were scholars that we had to refer back to. And I say had to because of their scholasticism and their standing in the Muslim world. So that was fine for us. We would refer to our teachers who knew students of knowledge, and we would be following and learning what positions were the correct positions to be taken, even though there were these divisions between these contemporary scholars. And despite this division between them, we saw the mutual respect continue there. You had other emerging and senior scholars as well, not as senior as the 3 I've mentioned, but those like Sheikh Muqbil in Yemen also voicing his opposition to the Saudi position in that instance. But the more insipid and problematical opposition came from those who capitalized upon the position of the Salafi scholars. And we're talking about extremist protagonists like Abdul al-Faisal and Abu Hamza al-Misri, who were based in the UK at the time. They started monopolizing upon this division and actually propagating their Khariji takfir dawah even more profusely than before. And one of the sticking points and areas that I remember very much regarded around Faisal, should I say, was him testing individuals regarding their allegiance on this particular issue. And he would ask a question that had doctrinal import and significance, but his question was from a false premise. So, for example, I remember in a debate with him, he would ask, who do you prefer to be raised with on the day of judgment, King Fahad or Osama bin Laden? And because of our grounding and our learning at that particular stage, we knew that this was a mute question. We knew that this was a baseless question because when we look at what our tenets of faith tell us, and when we look at Quranic injunction and descriptions, we know that on the day of judgment, for example, we will be so preoccupied with ourselves. Our preoccupation will be with ourselves alone, not our mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, or anyone else, let alone Osama bin Laden or King Fahd. And I want to read the English rendition briefly of a verse in some verses in the 80th chapter of the Quran, which confirm exactly what I'm saying. So, for example, verse 34 of that chapter says, that day shall a man flee from his brother, and from his mother and his father, and from his wife and his children. Every man that day will have enough to make him careless of others. Okay, those are the verses from 34 to 37 of the 80th chapter of the Quran. So when we juxtapose those verses that I've just given with the rhetoric of Abdul al-Faisal, it's very simple to refute his erroneous question. However, those who were not grounded, those who were more politicized in their understanding at this formative stage and driven by emotional rhetoric started to listen and give ear to Faisal and his rhetoric against the scholars who had made the decision to allow Saudi American troops onto Saudi soil. So this was the sort of context that was taking place. And you also had in Saudi Arabia the Sahwa movement emerging with Salman Auda and Safa Hawali, who were dissenting voices against the scholars and the Mufti at that particular time. So this was a very, very volatile environment for us as new Muslims to be learning in. However, the strategy of our teachers was to continue our focus on the fundamentals. So, referring to the lesson of the 13th of February 1991, we were being taught about Ramadan and preparation for Ramadan over the coming months. So, the first lesson on that day was about how the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, prepared for Ramadan, the linguistic and religious understanding of fasting, the permissible and impermissible acts of fasting, the spiritual objectives of fasting. We had our first referencing to research from volume 3 of the very famous authentic hadith collection, Bukhari. And we were told to go and look up the chapter on fasting to learn more and prepare accordingly. Now, at that time, it's important to note that religious books, authentic religious books in the English language were few and far to come by. And some may remember the early Bukhari collection with the green covering and the very archaic language that was used in translation. However, we were still keen to read these statements of the Prophet, his behavior, the Sunnah, as it were, of Islam in that instance. I remember my very first hadith actually that I read when I would be relaxing in the mosque in my free time from another authentic collection called Sahih Muslim. And that very first hadith that I read, which amazed me in its clarity, was about the believer seeing Allah on the Day of Judgment in paradise as clearly as we would see the full moon. So this is an example of the few books that were available in English at the time, hence the religious instruction we were receiving, hence the amount of handwritten notes that I have maintained until this particular day. So moving on very rapidly, the prevailing climate was that of war, huge global event taking place, yet our focus was still on preparing ourselves for Ramadan, how to fast properly, to know the rights and regulations of Ramadan, and to really reap the rewards when that blessed month actually came around. So on the 27th of February, more focus on Ramadan, the iftar meals, the breaking fast meal and its etiquette. Then the following day, the global event, again, the 28th of February, the Gulf War ended. Iraq accepted a ceasefire and withdrew from Kuwait. Did we postpone classes? Did we start discussing it and having discussions, group discussions? No. We moved on to the 6th of March and continued with our religious instruction, learning about Ramadan and the 97th chapter of the Quran, the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, what it meant, the level of worship we should aspire to. And then on the 13th of March, we focused on Taraweeh prayers, the additional congregational night prayers in Ramadan. So this focus continued. And in actuality, while we were focusing on the fundamentals, the beginning of 1991 had so many events of significance that one could say it would be easy to be distracted. But what we were learning was a contextualized understanding and where to place importance and significance as it affected ourselves immediately and our spiritual development. So, for example, 7th of February, the IRA launched a mortar attack on 10 Downing Street, 7th of February. On the 3rd of March, we saw LAPD, Los Angeles Police, severely beat and brutalize Rodney King, motorist Rodney King, African American. Now, sticking with that particular event on the 3rd of March, the reason why this was of such significance, especially to Black people, was because at last the brutalization of a Black individual at the hands of the police was now recorded. It had been captured on camcorder. And in 1991, we didn't have mobile phones with cameras, there was no internet. So, this recording being captured and going viral by today's definition of the word was something that had established and proved what many of us had experienced at the hands of the police in the US, in the UK, for decades now. And that's why this was a significant event in itself. However, our learning continued. And before I continue with that process of learning, it's important that looking at these events, first at the launch of the Gulf War at the beginning of the year, and at this event with Rodney King, there's an interesting parallel that can be joined with today, because we see that General Colin Powell, a Jamaican American or African American, was at the top of the food chain in America, at the top of the hierarchy at the time in the military as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he presided over what I say, and many would say, was the oppression and death of tens of thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, or food chain as you like, we had Rodney King being brutalized by another echelon of the US apparatus, state apparatus, the police. And when you draw parallels with today, we recently heralded the president, the election of an African American president, President Obama, at the top of the food chain, at the top of the hierarchy. And with him, we saw an increase in zone attacks, in drone attacks on innocent civilians in foreign territories. And at the same time, further down the food chain, we continue to witness the brutalization and murder of African American, innocent African American young men, and on some occasions, women. And the only difference on this occasion is technological advancement with social media, smartphones, that can capture the extent of this brutalization. And there's a poignant message in these two parallels from 1991 and the current time, 2019 now, in that no matter how high up the hierarchy, the ladder, an African American goes, it makes absolutely no difference to what happens to his fellow culturally aligned communities at the lower strata. Anyway, I've digressed enough and I want to move on due to time. So, moving to the 4th of April 1991, this coincided with the 18th of Ramadan, and we continued our lessons, learning more chapters of the Quran, learning about the 15 verses of prostration. And just a quick side note, I referred to the framework that I developed in my PhD, um, the cognitive development framework for converts. And we were still very much at that first phase, the founding conversion phase. And it's important to highlight this. Why? Because I mentioned in the previous episode that if at this stage there is politicization of the new Muslim, the returnee Muslim, then he or she are at a very, very precarious stage of development. So the fact that we had been grounded in these fundamentals and were continuing to be grounded in these fundamentals are what I believe kept us from being so affected by this seismic global event of the Gulf War. Also, it kept us focused with regards to the injustices that we continue to see post-Islam with the racism from the non-Muslim communities, the Rodney King instance that we had a lot of resonance with, and the racism that we were receiving from the South Asian, Arab, more predominant cultural communities in the UK as we became familiar with various communities across the UK. So the founding phase was a significant phase for us, and the level of instruction that we received on the fundamentals of the faith are what kept us, I think, firm in our understanding of Sunni Islam, mainstream Islam, contextualizing how to practice within UK society as new Muslims. Moving to the next stage very quickly now, I think it's very important that when teachers come into a religious educational institution, be it a mosque, a college, university, or the like, that the management are fully aware of who is coming in, that they've done their research and their checks on such an individual. And the reason I mention this is because as we were learning in Brixton Mosque, the management were very much about Quran and Sunnah and black Muslims being able to use and congregate in the premises. However, as I've mentioned, we had Surat Abdul Malik, Salafi, seasoned from America, established. Okay, Suleiman Abdul Sabor, who was very much Quran and Sunnah, but moved more towards the manhaj understanding of Salafism, under the I think auspices of Surat Abdul Malik. So when we were asked to attend general classes with an individual who had graduated from Medina called Abdul Malik at Trinidadi, the appellation is because of his origins from Trinidad. His first few lessons were interesting. However, we became concerned about the direction and his interpretation of particular religious tenets and verses of the Quran. So on the 5th of May, he gave a class that was on the 96th chapter of the Quran, called Alaq. Okay, and I'll read from his notes, which were relatively non-contentious, and then I will proceed on to why we decided to no longer attend any other classes after the first two. So, quote, the first five verses of the Quran, of this chapter, were the first revealed to Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Darwin's theory tried to disprove the fact that Allah created everything. This theory goes completely against the first verse of this chapter. Quoting the chapter in English, the rendition, recite in the name of your Lord who created, close quote. Continuing with my notes from this class, all dependency must be on Allah. The unbelieving society, I've said that in English, but the word I actually wrote was the kufr, the disbelieving society, Kufr, invites one to become dependent on it by way of loans, i.e. mortgages, etc. We see that the so-called third world is dependent on the West. They cannot escape this dependency. Allah, in this surah, in this chapter, invites man to depend on him. The first five verses indicate the importance of learning. Close quote. So Those are not contentious, as I mentioned at all. His subsequent class on the 12th of May was about the next chapter that I've mentioned we learned in Ramadan, the Night of Power, the 97th chapter. But the reason we stopped learning from him is because it quickly became aware that he was advocating open interpretations to some of the verses that he was giving, and the results of such interpretation amongst individuals who were not versed, who were new to the religion, that had not undergone any structured learning up until now, was very, very dangerous. And one of the examples was that he used a verse in chapter 7, Surah Al-Araf, verse 66, to promote his open interpretation, mischievous interpretation to the Quran. And this is what he would use. The verse says in English, the rendition being, "Do not make mischief on the earth after it has been set in order." Close quote. He would follow up this particular verse with a question: Is the earth in order? So his intimation was just that mischief could be made due to what was perceived as chaos societally and across the world. Now, I will mention here to clarify that he was not advocating violent extremism, non-violent extremism, or terrorism. However, the results of such an open-ended question and intimation led to some very worrying results amongst peers who did not traverse the path of Salafism that we were, or the classes that we were continuing to undertake. And we saw from this the interpretation, which he endorsed, that the society we lived in, the Western society we lived in, could be considered an abode of war, Dar al-Harb, much like the Kharijite Takfiri extremists consider Western society, the Western world, and even Muslim societies, like Said Qutb considered Egypt, even though it was a Muslim predominated country, predominantly Muslim country, as Dar al-Harb. Saudi Arabia is considered that for the extremists as well. So that understanding can lead to, and often leads to, disastrous consequences, as we know. And at that early stage in 1991, it led some former colleagues, not Salafi, to traverse a path of nightclubbing, saying that the women that they were their girlfriends were what their right hands possess, credit card fraud, and the like. Also, they would not greet us publicly because it was upon them, as they said, to hide their identity. And this even led some of them to avoid naming their newborn children Muslim names so as to ensure that no Muslim identity was attributed to their children as they grew, so they could continue to suppress their religious ideology and delineation. So that is why it's so important to know who the teachers are, the imams, and their credentials coming into such institutions. And I will conclude because I've gone over the time that I had allocated only slightly, but I will conclude on articulating some of the classes that I continue to have throughout the year. On the 15th of May, one of our classes reviewed the superiority of the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, and we focused on narration from Bukhari, the Hadith collection, volume 6, page 491, chapter 10. On the 22nd of May, we looked at religious jurisprudence around purification, internal and external purification, tahara. And on the 3rd of July, from the 3rd of July until the 31st of July, we had 5 classes in which we were looking at earning a living, marriage and family life, birth control, the rights of the wife over the husband, and vice versa. Throughout August, we continued learning these particular rights and ethics, as well as further supplications and chapters from the Quran. And then on the 13th of November, we refocused again on the categories of monotheism, the categories of Tawheed,